just a heads up, I'm going to be saying both Godzilla and Gojira because I'm an inconsistent loser and didn't want to nail down a singular way of saying it, so yeah. Godzilla Minus One is the 438th Godzilla movie to ever be released, and considering I've only seen about 6 Godzilla movies ever, I thought this movie was pretty dang neat. Just swell, good soup. Do I think it's worth all of the hype it's been getting? Yup. Do I think it's as good as everyone says it is?
No.
So Godzilla and I have a weird relationship where I never really got too into the franchise, but I have a momentous amount of respect for it. I always saw Godzilla as a representation of the misery the Japanese had to endure before, during, and after World War II, although many people directly relate him to atomic or nuclear power. I don't see that as being the only thing he represents thematically, and I've been waiting a while for a movie that addresses this, and I honestly couldn't be happier. However, I can see people being upset by the lack of nuclear thematic relevance that's present in this movie, and they're not wrong. See, while I not only see Godzilla representing different things regarding Japan, I also understand many recognize him exclusively with nuclear power and the danger it can lead to, and I mean, they're not wrong. The original Godzilla is very clearly a stand-in for the message of nuclear testing bad, so much so that they explicitly lay out the theme at the end of the movie.
もし水爆実験が続けて行われるとしたら、ゴジラの盗塁が。
But I also think Godzilla has grown far past that sole purpose for existing and has entered into the level of Japanese icon. Personally for me, I think it's very humble and bold of Japan to have their country's icon be a reminder of the dark days for Japan and to recognize where they were and how they would like to progress as seen in this movie. And for those asking why the thematic relevance of Godzilla is so important, Godzilla represents Japan's cultural identity to a degree. Now, do I think that was the intent with the classic Gojira? Not at all, but over here in the West, that's how audiences can view Godzilla in relation to Japan, considering he was in indirect relation to arguably the most important moments in human history. Not to even mention that Gojira was created by the very nation that historical event impacted. The thematic relevance of Godzilla is important whether you agree with that statement or not, and is part of the reason why I believe the legendary movies have fumbled so miserably. Not financially, of course, but in spirit. That part of movies that we watch for escapism but can reinterpret into our current world and lives. You know, the thing that makes movies culturally impactful. The whole point I'm trying to make is Godzilla has transformed farther than what he was originally intended, and if this movie's thematic relevance is anything to go by, I think it's for the better. Now, Godzilla Minus One serves as a complete remake of the original aside from the name, which I don't really get. Fuck it, give this movie the title. I think it's deserving of simply being called Gojira. If ever there was a spiritual successor to OG Gojira, this would be it. I know a lot of people praise Shin Gojira as being the best Godzilla movie, and they're probably right, which we'll get to down the road, but Minus One is almost exactly what I want out of a Godzilla movie, as well as serving as a perfect successor to the classic movie. The amount of nationalism that's in this movie is so alluring. I love movies with a huge nationalistic message. Gotta be one of my favorite genders. The amount of awareness this movie has about its own country in this time period is very enjoyable to see. I love watching characters discuss the values of their country, what they haven't been valuing enough, how they feel about their country in a post-World War II world. It's so very much honoring the past while simultaneously recognizing the faults they've had along the way. A true nation's pride, one might say. So the plot centers around Koichi, a failed kamikaze pilot who abandoned his mission and chose to live. After surviving an attack by a much smaller Godzilla, he returns home to find his home destroyed and family killed, until one day a family falls into his lap by the names of Noriko and Akiko. Koichi over the following years takes up a job destroying leftover mines from the war to help support his newfound family, until he and his crewmates are sent to distract an ever-growing and even stronger Godzilla. But it soon becomes clear that Godzilla isn't stopping at just ships and decides to claim all of Japan as its territory. The movie carries a massive theme of survivor's guilt, which is exemplified perfectly through Koichi as he struggles with understanding why he was allowed to live after bailing out of his kamikaze and surviving Godzilla. His whole arc is about finding meaning in a life you think has no meaning, especially when you were prescribed to die. He's just a really strong character that feels authentic. He has trauma, desires, skills, and a strong moral code that gets tested time and time again. Koichi is someone who was prescribed to die and live long enough to experience a national tragedy. His survivor's guilt is incredibly fleshed out, every scene with him is used so effectively, and it's really amazing in comparison to how bad things have gotten in Hollywood nowadays.
I came to this island to die.
Koichi is in a relationship with Noriko, a runaway who is watching over a young child named Akiko. Koichi, Noriko, and Akiko have all suffered due to the horrors of World War II, most specifically during the US's firebombing of Tokyo, leaving them to become alone and desperate. However, when their paths meet, they manage to find a common understanding between each other and start rebuilding their lives together. Not as a traditional family, but a family nonetheless. Noriko is a fucking queen, and any man would be lucky to have her by his side. Noriko is such a supportive figure to Koichi, even if her romantic love for him is one-sided. Their love for each other is thoroughly established, tested, and proven throughout this movie. The scene where Noriko comforts Koichi about his trauma is just incredible. It breaks my heart every fucking time. But it's not just the main characters, even the side characters are fucking great. Sumiko is easily top 3 characters in this movie, and it's not even close. She's a side character, but the arc she goes on from despising Koichi for his inability to commit to his kamikaze to thoroughly supporting his family is just delightful. It makes perfect sense why she would despise Koichi. Her home was destroyed, her 3 children murdered due to the firebombing by the US, and the one person who the Japanese government likely propagated to be responsible for the saving of Japan is right in front of her eyes, alive. Like, of course she would blame him. But of course her motherly nature would resurface once she realizes Akiko is without proper parents. She manages to find a new life helping them in the literal destruction of her old life. It's just wonderful. Even Koichi's crew is so clearly distinguishable and have their own shtick going on. Mizushima is the young hot-headed one who missed out on the war and is looking to earn his stripes, so to speak. Yoji is the captain of the ship and clearly has a disdain for the Japanese government and yet will jump to their service at a moment's notice because he loves his country and would do anything to see it survive. And Kenji is the big brain of the group. Kenji was actually my favorite of the crew. He reminded me of someone who would be in my family. He's incredibly knowledgeable and able to piece 2 and 2 together, however, he also has a past. Kenji was once a weapon engineer for the Japanese Navy, and in doing so, likely contributed to a lot of the horrors the Japanese military committed, not only to the US, but their own citizens. Which makes his speech about preserving life and how Japan has treated life too cheaply so much more impactful because it's likely coming from someone who contributed to that devaluation. Good shit, Toho. Just bravo. Now that we've talked about our characters, let's talk about the monster of the hour, Big Daddy G. Now, here's my thing with Godzilla. I don't love a lot of Godzilla's designs. I can rock with the OG design, and I love the design from 2014 Godzilla, but all the others have been, nah. That's kinda how I feel about this design. I don't know, it's just something regarding the proportion between his arms and legs in this one that just really turns me off. It wasn't an issue in the beginning when he showed up on Odo Island, so I don't know why they changed it. Like, just make his arms bigger. Also, yeah, the way he looks on Odo Island is a clear homage to Godzilla 1998, and you can't convince me otherwise. Look at this shit. Like, I'm certain this design may be your favorite, and you're entitled to that, but it's just really weird how everyone's calling this the best Godzilla design because he put on his angry eyes. Also, I found the way he walked to be really mechanical, like he'll take a step and then pause for a second or two before taking another one. The intention was to make it seem like he's catching up with his own weight, but I never really bought into that considering Godzilla in the 2014 movie clearly shows a larger-than-life monster that weighs thousands, if not millions of pounds, but still moves how an animal of this size would in a very natural way. Also, Godzilla in the OG movie never walked with such a lag, so there's really no point for it here considering this movie in almost every regard is a spiritual successor, reboot, whatever you want to call it, of the classic Gojira. Now, Godzilla beyond his design is pretty weird. For one, he doesn't really act like an animal all the time. Sometimes he acts like a prop, like when our lads drop a mine into his mouth and it's just kinda sitting there. I don't know, I feel like Godzilla would spit that out considering its size, or maybe just turn his head to shake it out. Literally anything other than letting it sit in his mouth. There's also a moment in the end where the free peoples of Japan are trying to lasso Godzilla so they can release Freon and sink him, but Godzilla just sits there waist high in water and does nothing. Like, there's so much wrong with this scene, my brain was exploding. Why didn't Godzilla dive below to avoid being lassoed? He's just sitting there waiting for something to happen. Also, how is he waist high in water? That's thousands of feet deep. Like, King of the Monsters did this bullshit, and everyone hated it then, so why is it accepted here? Well, the general consensus is that Minus One is the better Godzilla movie, and therefore these issues can be ignored. I don't agree with that by any means, especially if you've seen my previous work. It was ridiculous here, and it's ridiculous here. I'd also like to take a moment to talk about the radiation aspect of Godzilla. You know, the component that turned him from the folk legend of Odo Island into the behemoth we generally know him as. Godzilla has always been known to carry high levels of radiation, and that extends as far back to the original and is once again present here, but almost every movie he's in doesn't treat him like the walking reactor he's described to be. Like, in this movie, they have to use radiation detectors in order to tell when Godzilla is coming, but they also treat Godzilla like he's radioactive until he's not. His footprints leave traces of radiation, but our main characters are completely safe after surviving his wake time and time again. Our main character gets drenched in black rain due to the atomic fallout of Godzilla's atomic breath, which by the way is highly radioactive, and yet the consequences of this event are never brought up 10 days later. You've gotta be shitting me. The way in which this movie sweeps aside Godzilla's radioactivity can be minimized down to a theme with which they're trying to present, which is the consequences of war and the preservation of life. However, the movie is trying to have its cake and eat it too by reminding us that Godzilla is in fact radioactive without committing to the ramifications of such. Like guys, Shin Gojira did this better in almost every regard. It's almost never a forgotten element of Godzilla that he is radioactive aside from this one scene. But every other scene the government is keeping their distance, and even at a distance they remember to wear hazmat suits. And I want to reiterate that Shin Gojira is not perfect with this, but nonetheless, the consequences of the events are far greater in this movie than in Shin Gojira. Like, there is an argument to be had that Yaguchi may have avoided being inflicted with radioactive flames, but there's no excuse here. Our main character gets feet away from Godzilla's face seconds before he's about to fire his atomic breath and gets drenched in black rain, and yet there are no repercussions. This is an issue. Aside from all those issues though, I liked him. When he punched the buildings, my brain was happy. This shot is glorious and will make an absolutely beautiful wallpaper. Let's talk about world building. So the world in this movie takes place during the final days of World War II and shortly after. I think this is the era most suitable for Godzilla, specifically thematically, because, well, but that doesn't mean you can't have Godzilla movies taking place literally any other time period. This is just my personal favorite for thematic relevance, but also because it's interesting watching post-war Japan combat this walking dinosaur with 1940s technology. They can't just nuke him, they can't get dozens of cranes to force feed him cryogenic chemicals, it's just people doing what they can with the scientific advantages present to them. Unless you include the classic Gojira where Dr. Serizawa creates the deoxygenator. The issues I have with the utilization of the world in this movie has more to do with the players, like the US, Russia, and even the Japanese government. All three want nothing to do with Godzilla for their own reasons. Like the US doesn't want to get involved because they don't want to increase hostilities with the Soviets. That's fine. I mean, Japan is close to Soviet waters, and Russia won't get involved due to Japan's allegiances to the US. But then you have the Japanese government not wanting to do anything regarding this walking disaster invading their land. No, I don't buy this shit for a second. The entire message the movie is trying to push through this is institution bad, people good, at the expense of decapitating the world building. This is blatant disregard for a theme that I personally enjoy, but in the proper context and not at the expense of the world building. Shin Gojira handled this immensely better. The US actually helps the Japanese government. China and Russia are ready to step in, which would greatly change the political landscape of Japan, but Japan basically decides, let's try our way first before we start reforming political allies. Like, it's not even a contest. The world building in these two movies is night and day. I know I've kind of been firebombing this movie, and I will get back to that shortly, but I do want to reiterate, the character work and thematic relevance in this movie is light years beyond what Shin Gojira manages to accomplish. That being said, there are still a multitude of issues I've yet to address. Like Noriko surviving an atomic shockwave. This bitch gets fucking launched by the overpressure of an atomic blast. Fucking blasted, absolutely yeeted, she is gone. But wait, there's more. She gets sucked back in. My god, the whiplash! This shockwave leveled buildings and killed almost everyone else within the vicinity, but somehow Noriko returned with a radioactive broken arm, a Serizawa eye patch, and the black mark? Are you shitting me? This black mark felt like a threat. Like, hey, wanna see a human infected with Godzilla?
No! No!
I had the same exact feeling seeing Barry Keoghan as the Joker. Like, please, just don't do this. You're better than this movie. Be the movie Mr. Rogers knew you could be. People can like this ending all they want. By God, don't let me have that much power over you. But I think we can all agree she should be dead. Koichi also survives Godzilla's atomic breath by taking shelter in an alleyway due to Noriko pushing him in, and Guys, are we really buying this? Like, this blast is leveling buildings, but this one alleyway survives? This is plot armor. It may as well be the definition. This is Kingdom of the Crystal Skull levels of plot armor. Stop justifying it by saying that people survived the Nagasaki and Hiroshima atomic blast. Not because that isn't true, but because they were likely very far from ground zero. Koichi isn't at ground zero, but he's also surrounded by absolute destruction. Stop justifying this. I also think it's pretty contrived that the one night Koichi stays at the Odo Island base is the night Godzilla chooses to reveal himself to them. This isn't a contrivance related to the premise, nor a contrivance that kicks off the plot either, considering Koichi is sent home anyways due to the end of the war, so this is still pretty scathing considering without this event, he and Tachibana's relationship wouldn't be nearly as fleshed out. I also think it's a contrivance how the one minesweeping ship Koichi happens to be on is the ship that gets sent to buy Japan time till the Takao shows up. And before you all begin, yes, I'm aware there's a second ship, however, it's so inconsequential it's barely worth mentioning. Rest in peace, crew of the Kaishin Maru. As mentioned before, Noriko and Koichi stumble into each other's lives, and I don't mind this idea on the surface, however, looking at the context, Noriko really just hands Akiko to Koichi out of all the people in a crowded market. It's very lazy, and I don't understand why they went this route. Koichi himself could have seen her struggling to escape the merchants and offered to watch Akiko for a little while so Noriko can get away. You know, because he's a good person at his core, and I would have bought that, but they didn't do that. They went with one of the laziest ways to introduce each other into their lives, which feels weird considering their relationship together is the big highlight of the movie for me. In conclusion, Godzilla Minus One is like the antithesis to Shin Gojira. It has fantastic character work with fleshed out and interesting characters with themes scoring very high, however plot and world building is blown to smithereens. Whereas Shin Gojira is almost entirely plot with pretty solid world building, a suitable theme, and weak characters. I will say though, I think Shin Gojira is the better movie, but I like Godzilla Minus One so much more. The reason being, as mentioned before, is because this movie is almost everything I want in a Godzilla movie. It's a Godzilla movie that finally manages to have some strong character work, a gripping theme, and some absolutely beautiful Godzilla moments. It's a movie that manages to form a story about people in the wake of a lost war who now must strive to build something individually important to them out of the wreckage. It's wholesome and it's well written on a character level, but when you break this movie down into its individual components, it begins to fall apart with plot and world building issues galore. Would still strongly recommend, especially if you've been waiting for a movie like this for a while like I have. A Godzilla movie that makes not only Godzilla, but the human characters the centerpiece, and does so very effectively. Anyways, that's all I got for you guys today, and I'll see you when the mothership decides enough is enough.